Howdy, folks. We're going to talk a little bit here about the rhetorical modes. Now, the rhetorical modes are a set of rhetorical choices that you should be able to identify in any rhetorical act that you come across, and in particular, if you should be able to identify them if you come across them on the AP exam. They are very common in the AP exam texts, and so you should be able to know what they are and label them accurately. Now, what are the rhetorical modes? They are specific ways of organizing and constructing an academic argument. They are also the patterns of organization of nonfiction texts and the building blocks of writing or argumentation. Now, I know these definitions all kind of seem like different things, but let me do my best to explain what connects them all together. You can think of rhetorical modes as the steps that a writer takes when they are building an academic argument. So, for example, if a writer wants to help you understand what it's like to work in a really disgusting kitchen in a low-budget restaurant, then the writer might spend some time defining exactly what low budget means. And then the writer might spend some time giving some examples of what makes the restaurant so disgusting. And then the writer might do some really vivid description about what the kitchen is actually looks and feels and smells like. And then maybe the writer would tell a story about someone who worked in that kitchen and what happened to them. So it's you can imagine how doing all of those things would take up several pages, maybe even several chapters of a book. And so and that ultimately is how a lot of academic writing, including the independent reading books that you're reading right now, are actually put together. So there are 10 of the rhetorical modes in total, and we're going to go through and talk about all of them. Each one of them is actually pretty simple. I think you'll find the rhetorical modes easier to understand, the specific ones easier to understand than some of the rhetorical devices that we've talked about, other rhetorical choices we've talked about so far. So, another thing I want to say before we jump into the 10 rhetorical modes. What you can see on the screen here is the XYZ rhetorical analysis framework, the same one we've talked about and worked with repeatedly over the course of second quarter. Of course, the X piece refers to specific rhetorical choices, and we talked about how there are rhetorical choices based on grammar, some of which you've learned and we've talked about, and how there are some that are based on meaning, especially the figurative language, the hyperbole, the allusion, tone, and diction. Those are all meaning-based rhetorical choices. However, there's this last category that we haven't talked much about, and that last category is the rhetorical choices that are based on argumentative structure. And the rhetorical modes fall into that category. So the important thing to take away here is that rhetorical modes are X pieces. They function just like all the other rhetorical choices that you've learned about so far. For example, you might have a narrative, a story, the rhetorical mode of narration that makes the audience feel an intense sense of sadness for the person who engaged in or who had to go through whatever the story said they did, which then in turn helped to convince an audience that the world should be different so people don't have to go through that sort of thing, right? That was just a kind of a random example. So think of them as X pieces. In a rhetorical analysis paragraph or essay, you could say the author uses narration in order to help readers understand the difficulty of experiencing blank, whatever it is. All right, so our first rhetorical mode is narration. Some people also call it narrative. that technically it should be called narration, but you will hear me and you will probably hear your peers say narrative from time to time as well, and either is okay. It means the same thing. This is where a writer achieves a purpose or furthers an argument by telling a story or recounting a series of events. Now, the story might be of the writer's lived experience, something that they actually did, or it could be somebody else's story as well that they are telling. Now, authors might use narration to give background information necessary to a later part of the argument. This is very common in the world of academia and nonfiction writing. They start with a story, especially to get the reader's attention, to hook the reader, to make the reader feel feelings, right? And then that sort of helps the writer, the speaker, to move the audience toward what they actually want to say, toward the meat of their argument. Some examples. You really should take anti-nausea medication before riding the roller coasters at Magic Mountain. One time I went to Magic Mountain and I went on the really big roller coasters and I got so sick, but then I had the good idea of buying some Dramamine, and I took the Dramamine and waited an hour, ate some food, and then I was not sick on the roller coasters, and it was great. So do that. Right, you can see that I just used a story of something that happened to me. That's an actual story, by the way, in order to try to convince you of something. It was a really tiny example, but that is narration, using narration in order to achieve a purpose. Here's another example. Don't even consider eating at that restaurant. One time, my friend Rose went there, and the food was really disgusting, and she also got a terrible case of the Hershey squirts after having eaten there. Also, an anecdote is another term that's often used. I've seen this in the answers on the multiple choice section of the AP Lang exam. It just means a short narrative, right? A very, very short bit of story that is used to achieve a purpose. All right, that's it for the rhetorical mode of narration. Our second one is description. That's where a writer achieves a purpose or furthers an argument by vividly describing something. Now, description requires the use of sensory details, and that is specific references to the five senses: visual, olfactory, gustatory, tactile, and auditory senses. Or if you prefer the nouns, sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing. Some examples. Old Palo Alto should win the America's Most Beautiful Neighborhood prize because all the houses are super well kept and the paint is beautiful and there's all these flowers everywhere and all the trees change colors in the fall and it's just amazing and gorgeous, right? I could go on and on. This rainforest is really beautiful and special and should be preserved by whatever means necessary for these reasons. And you could go on to describe exactly why it's so beautiful and should be preserved. That would be description. Being stuck in traffic is an incredibly frustrating experience because you have to deal with the hot sun beating down on you when you're in the car, and the annoying buzz of the air conditioner, and the people honking all the time, and the sound of the wheels moving on the freeway, and you look out the window and you see the faded paint and the trash on the side of the road, and all of it just makes you so angry, right? So I just kind of described the experience of sitting in traffic. You could talk about why landfills are disgusting, what you see there. I'm not going to do that right now. But again, all of these would be examples of description if they're used to achieve a rhetorical purpose. You'll often see description used to complement other modes. In particular, description will often come with narration, and they will go together. A story is told using vivid description, vivid sensory details. Now, if you come across description as a rhetorical mode, you could label it the rhetorical mode of description. You could label it imagery, You could label it sensory details. All of those would be accurate labels. You can choose which one you think is the best. All right, our third rhetorical mode is definition. This is when a writer achieves a purpose or furthers an argument by clarifying the meanings of terms. As part of definition, you might find the writer explaining the limits that apply to his or her definition. A definition is commonly seen early in a text or just after a major shift in the text's topic, tone, or argument. So that's where it typically is found. Some examples. For the purposes of this argument, the term climate change is referring to, and then you state what it's actually referring to. I'm pretty sure for anyone reading, anyone who's reading or might have read This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein, I'm pretty sure she does this in like the first or second chapter. She states exactly what she means by capitalism and climate change. Right, and that's the rhetorical mode of definition. In order for something to be beneficial for a school, or success for the purposes of this argument means, right, this is actually two examples. You would have to define what beneficial is, or you would have to define what success is given the context, which in this case is a school. Organic really just means, and then you state what organic means before you go on to make your argument about what food people should or should not buy. And last example, drought can be defined as, and you can give a clear definition of what drought is before you go on to make an argument about water and water rights. Our fourth rhetorical mode is exemplification. Exemplification is when a writer achieves a purpose or furthers an argument by providing examples that support one or more claims. Now, this is not the same thing as defining terms. Examples are like specific instances of a broader idea or a broader phenomenon. Now, examples are really awesome because they help to make abstract concepts more concrete or real, and they take really complex ideas and they make it more understandable for a reader or a listener. Malcolm Gladwell is known to be the great exemplifier. He uses lots of exemplification in his work. Usually he'll give the example first and talk about what happened, and then he'll analyze it and talk about like, okay, what actually happened here and how can we unpack it and explain what took place. So that is exemplification. More examples. The new federal tax plan is not a good one. For example, it raises the amount of money that low-income and middle-income people have to pay and decreases the amount that wealthy people have to pay, which is not good for our society as a whole. Robust, well-funded public education can help lift people out of poverty. Consider the example of this person who grew up very low income in a small town, but did well in school and was able to, go to college, get an education, and move into the middle class. Tracking and laning is not the best way to serve students who struggle in school. Look at 9th grade English at Pali, where a great effort has been put into taking all the students who need extra help and spreading them out among all the classes. So then there's only a few students who need a lot of extra help in each class, and the teacher can give them the attention they need without being overwhelmed and neglecting other students. Incarceration is not the best way to reduce crime. Consider the 3 strikes law in California, which had all of these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 really negative consequences. And then the specific situations would be that were caused by that law would be described. If you just said it was bad, that would actually be a different rhetorical mode, so you'd have to be careful. All right. Fifth rhetorical mode is process analysis. Now, this is where a writer achieves a purpose or furthers an argument by explaining how something works or how to do something. Some examples. might be the math placement system in the middle grades at Pally. First a student needs to do blank, and then a student needs to do blank, and then a student needs to earn a score on blank, right? And all of these hurdles are inequitable because often lower income students aren't able to do those things, and so that math placement system needs to change. That's an argument that would use process analysis. Talk about the process, then use the process in order to make an argument. Another example would be in the book How Democracies Die by Levitsky and Ziblatt. This is it's a really great book. It essentially talks about how there is a cycle that all democracies that have ever existed go through, starting with the beginnings of the democracy and the idealism, but then people over time get complacent and they rely too much on their government, and then the people who have more money and power take over, and then people end up in bondage again instead of in a democracy, and it just goes on and on and on. So anyway, his argument is such a great example of process analysis, because he uses a process in order to say, or I should say they use a process in order to argue what they want to argue. Now, all recipes, instruction manuals, and guidebooks, anything that gives you steps to do, use process analysis, but these documents are not usually necessarily persuading. They're just giving you information about how to do something, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but they're not actually necessarily making an argument, right? They're just giving steps. So to call that the rhetorical mode of process analysis would be a stretch. The process has to be in service of an argument for it to be that rhetorical mode. All right. Number 6 is cause and effect. This is where a writer achieves a purpose or furthers an argument by considering the causal relationships between events. Careful with that word causal there. It's not casual, it's causal relationships. Now, essentially what that means is X caused Y, or Y is the result of X. That is what it means. Now, you'll often see this used as a really effective rhetorical choice when a writer tries to explain an unexpected causal link, and then as a result, lead a reader to see a situation in a new light, right? So X causes Y, and no one realizes that X causes Y. Everyone thinks that W and V cause Y, but that's not it. It's actually X, right? That is a common kind of argument. Some examples. The COVID-19 pandemic had effects A, B, and C on the economy. Those are the effects. Climate change is a human-driven phenomenon. In this sentence, it's actually the human is the driver, is the cause, and climate change is the effect. In this one, though, climate change is to blame for the recent hurricanes. Climate change is the cause, and hurricanes are the effect. Be careful, they might be presented in that opposite order. You have to think about it. Sometimes writers will start with the cause-effect claim and then explain effects, and that's called deductive reasoning, right? They say, here's a cause, here's a cause, here's a cause, here's a cause, right? And then here are all the effects of these causes. Others might start with a list of effects and build up to some causal relationship. So they start with, all of these effects, and then that leads up to one central cause. And the reader might actually be able to figure out what the cause is even before the writer gets there, in some cases, if it's really well written. All right, number 7 is comparison. You are in the royal presence of the rhetorical mode of comparison when a writer achieves a purpose or furthers an argument by explaining how two or more things are similar. Comparison is discussion of similarities. Some examples. Public transportation infrastructure in San Francisco, contrary to popular belief, is similar in quality, efficiency, and ridership to that of other cities. Someone would go on to then support this claim by talking about why it's similar in quality to, say, Paris or Washington, D.C., how it's similar in efficiency, and how it's similar in ridership. It would be a discussion of similarities. That is what would make it comparison. Number two, while there are important differences, COVID-19 and the 1918-1919 flu pandemic have more in common than one might think. One might then discuss the things they have in common. Or, this is actually literary analysis here, but it's also the rhetorical mode of comparison. While Poem 1 relies primarily on allusions and metaphors, Poem 2 instead uses a narrative style and imagery, right? Both poems convey a similar message, that people who persevere through difficult times often later feel a sense of personal strength. Right, so then this would be a discussion of there are different rhetorical or literary devices done or used in each poem, they convey the similar message. And clearly the focus, based on the way this thesis is written, is going to be on that similar message. So comparison. All right, contrast is our next one. This is where a writer achieves a purpose or furthers an argument by explaining how two or more things are different from each other. Some examples. Pally is a better school than Gun. So, for example, you could say Pally is a place where blank, blank, and blank are true, whereas at Gun, none of those things are true. Or Pally is a place where we have X, Y, and Z, but at Gun, they don't have those things. Cyberpunk 2077, it's a video game released in late 2020, was a colossal failure as a video game. Claim. Grand Theft Auto, a game released 7 years earlier, did X, Y, and Z in ways much more compelling for players than Cyberpunk 2077. So, and then one could go on to explain what those things are, and why they were so much better in Grand Theft Auto than Cyberpunk, all to prove that Cyberpunk was a failure. Our ninth rhetorical mode is classification, which also can be called division. Classification and division is where a writer achieves a purpose or furthers an argument by taking a single collection of things and sorting them into specific categories in some way, doing categorization. Now, the objective of classification and division might be to argue for this way of organizing ideas in general, or it might be to focus on one of the created categories, or it might be something else. Like the reason why a writer might choose to take a big group of things and put them into categories varies from text to text. It could be any of those. But if they're taking a group of things and dividing them up into categories, that is classification, also known as division. They're the same thing. Some examples. There are 3 kinds of blank, X, Y, and Z. And the author goes on to then explain the categorization and maybe also explain the implications of organizing things in this way. Another example, regular users of desktop computers generally fall into 3 categories. And then the writer might go on to make an argument about how computers should be designed or marketed, given those 3 categories that they created. All right, and number 10 is problem solution. A writer achieves a purpose or furthers an argument by presenting problems and then offering potential solutions to those problems, usually in that order. Some examples. A high degree of traffic congestion at the intersection of Churchill Avenue and Alma Street on a school day mornings is unsafe and needs to change. Problem. The writer might then go on to talk about why that needs to change, why it's a problem, what the issues are. Then some potential solutions might be for the city of Palo Alto to do X, Y, and Z. 4:10 p.m. is far too late to end a school day, and the change to this timing caused many unforeseen issues. Here are all the problems, like athletes having almost no time to practice in daylight in November and December. Some ways we could remedy the situation might be to move Pally's start time back to 8:30 a.m., which would be permissible under California law. And then we'd get out at 3:40 on some days and 3 o'clock on others. How cool would that be? All right, so those are our 10 rhetorical modes. Go ahead and take a look at your specific assignment for this year so that you know what it is that you need to do now that you have been introduced to them. Thank you, folks.